Judge Marlon Thompson was driving home on the quiet streets of his neighborhood after a long and challenging day in court. He had just presided over a high profile case that had tested his patience and his commitment to fairness. He was a man of dignity and pride. In his work, his mind was focused on the evening ahead, a quiet dinner with his wife and children in their cozy home in the suburbs. But as he cruised along the winding road, with the evening sun fading in the rearview mirror, a sudden flash of lights behind him startled him, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced in the mirror and saw the unmistakable blue and red flashing lights of a police car. Instinctively, he slowed down and turned his signal on, pulling over to the side of the road. As he came to a stop, the weight of the situation didn't fully register. At first, he had been pulled over countless times before in his life. But there was something different about this one. It wasn't the usual routine of a simple traffic stop. There was an underlying tension in the air that made him uneasy. He sat still in his car for a moment, taking a deep breath, before reaching for his wallet and his registration papers in the glove compartment. He had dealt with his fair share of racial profiling over the years, but he had learned to remain calm and composed no matter the circumstances. After all, he was a judge. He had earned his position through years of hard work and dedication. But more than that, he was a black man in America, and that often came with challenges that others might never understand. As he prepared to interact with the officer, his thoughts briefly flashed back to the many cases he had ruled on involving police misconduct and racial injustice. He knew this was a moment where the power dynamics could easily tip in an uncomfortable direction. He straightened his suit and placed his hands on the steering wheel as a gesture of calmness, but also of control. It was a reminder to himself that he was not just a man behind the wheel, but a man of the law. The officer approached his car with a steady pace, but there was an unmistakable edge to his movements. Judge Thompson noted the officer's posture as he stepped closer to the window. The officer's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, as if sizing him up. The officer cleared his throat, and in a voice that lacked any warmth, he asked for Judge Thompson's license and registration. The judge replied in his usual composed tone, "Here you go, officer," handing over the requested documents. The officer took a long look at the papers before raising his gaze back to Judge Thompson. His eyes lingered for a moment longer than necessary, and the judge could feel the scrutiny behind them. Something was off. It wasn't just the polite yet mechanical request for documents. It was the way the officer held himself, like he had already decided something about the judge before even hearing a word. The officer's next question didn't come as a surprise, but it still felt uncomfortable. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked, his voice somewhat curt and dismissive. Judge Thompson paused for a moment as he tried to decipher the officer's intentions. "No, officer, I don't," he responded, keeping his tone polite and neutral. But the officer's gaze never left him, and that was when Judge Thompson's instincts told him that this wasn't a simple case of a traffic violation. It was something else altogether. The officer didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning Judge Thompson's face, his expression unreadable. The silence between them hung thick in the air, and for a moment, the judge couldn't help but feel the weight of the officer's gaze. It was as though the man was searching for something more than just a reason to pull him over, something beyond the routine exchange of information. Thompson shifted in his seat, trying to maintain his calm as he watched the officer's every movement. He could tell this wasn't just about a simple traffic stop, not when the officer had started scrutinizing him so closely. After what felt like an eternity, the officer finally spoke again, his voice still tight, but this time laced with an edge. "You were swerving a bit back there. I thought you might be under the influence," he said, though the judge had been driving perfectly fine. Thompson kept his face neutral, resisting the urge to respond sarcastically or defensively. "I'm not under the influence, officer," he said calmly. "I've just had a long day in court. I'm tired, but I assure you, I'm perfectly fine." The officer nodded slowly, but the tension didn't lift. Instead, it seemed to deepen. He didn't ask any more questions about driving or sobriety, but his eyes never left Judge Thompson's face, as if he was still sizing him up. The judge knew that this wasn't about the driving at all. It was about something else, something the officer wasn't saying. His instincts told him the officer had already decided something about him based solely on his appearance, perhaps even his race. Thompson had felt this before many times in his life, but never in this moment, never while wearing the robes of a respected judge. A part of him considered just ending the exchange, telling the officer he was free to go, but he knew that wasn't the right move. There was something important at stake here. As a judge, he had a duty not only to uphold the law, but also to stand firm when injustice appeared, even in its smallest, most subtle form. If he let this go, it would be another small victory for racial prejudice, another unchallenged moment where someone in power felt entitled to treat him differently based on assumptions. "Can I ask you something, officer?" Judge Thompson said, his voice firm but respectful. The officer blinked, clearly not expecting the judge to take control of the conversation. "Why did you stop me?" Thompson continued. "You said I was swerving, but you've made no mention of any actual violation. I've given you my documents, and I haven't been anything but cooperative. So why the hostility?" The officer hesitated, caught off guard by the judge's calm but pointed inquiry. "I'm just doing my job, sir," he muttered, though his words felt less convincing now. "Just following procedure." Judge Thompson studied him for a moment, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the officer to feel the weight of his words. He could tell the officer wasn't prepared for someone to question his authority directly, especially not with the level of composure he was demonstrating. "I understand you're doing your job, officer," the judge said, his voice softening just a bit. "But part of that job is treating people with respect. I'm not sure you're doing that here." The officer's hand twitched slightly as if preparing to respond, but then something in his eyes shifted. There was a flicker of uncertainty, a brief moment of vulnerability. Judge Thompson could see it. The officer was faltering, but he wasn't yet willing to admit it. The judge knew this wasn't going to end easily, but he wasn't backing down. The officer cleared his throat, still trying to regain control of the moment. "Step out of the car," he said suddenly, his voice more forceful than before. The command hung in the air, and Judge Thompson felt a mix of surprise and determination rise within him. It wasn't just the request that alarmed him, it was the implication behind it. The officer wasn't just pulling him over for a traffic violation anymore. He was asserting his authority over someone he saw as out of place. With a steady exhale, Judge Thompson knew this moment was pivotal. It wasn't just a stop, it was a statement, and he was not going to let it pass quietly. He opened his door slowly, his hand still on the handle, preparing to stand his ground. Judge Thompson's mind raced as he stepped out of the car, the cool evening air brushing against his face. The officer stood in front of him now, slightly taller, a thin layer of tension still hanging between them. McAllister's body language was rigid, almost as if he expected something more from Thompson, a response he could use to justify his next move. The judge's feet met the asphalt with a quiet thud, but it felt like a loud statement in the stillness of the moment. He stood tall, his posture unyielding, his mind focused. "Why do you want me to step out of the car?" Judge Thompson asked, his voice steady and even, yet there was an underlying sharpness that cut through the tension. "There's been no sign of any criminal behavior, no reason to escalate this." The officer didn't respond immediately, instead watching him closely as if evaluating whether the judge would comply or challenge him further. The night had begun to feel heavy, the street lights casting long shadows across the scene. It was a quiet neighborhood, and yet, in this moment, it felt anything but peaceful. McAllister's posture shifted, and there was a flash of impatience in his eyes. "Step out of the vehicle, now," the officer repeated, this time with more force in his words, as if daring the judge to resist. The judge's heart beat a little faster, not out of fear, but out of recognition of what was happening. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It was an act of assertion, an officer trying to prove his dominance in a situation where he felt challenged. Thompson knew that whatever happened next could change the course of this encounter. "I'm a judge," Thompson said, his voice low but firm. "I don't think you need to ask me again." The words hung in the air, a quiet but powerful reminder of the weight of his position. McAllister, though, didn't flinch. In fact, his jaw tightened. He seemed to take offense at the judge's calm demeanor, as if the idea that Thompson could remain composed in such a moment unsettled him. Without saying another word, Judge Thompson stepped out of the car, standing tall and making sure his movements were slow and deliberate. His eyes remained locked on the officer, not with hostility, but with the quiet strength of someone who knew exactly where he stood. As he did, McAllister stepped back slightly, clearly caught off guard by the judge's unwavering confidence. The officer's gaze narrowed, but before he could speak, Thompson's calm voice cut through the tension again. "Are you detaining me, Officer McAllister, or am I free to go?" There was a brief moment of silence, the question hanging between them like a challenge, daring the officer to answer. The words detaining and free to go were not just legal terms. They were a signal that the judge was fully aware of his rights. McAllister seemed to hesitate for a second longer than Thompson had expected. His eyes darted to the judge's suit, to his demeanor. Each element that made Judge Thompson who he was, and something in him seemed to shift. McAllister opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, a flicker of recognition passed over his face. For the first time since the stop, the officer's demeanor faltered just slightly. Judge Thompson saw it in his eyes, the brief flash of realization, but it didn't bring the apology Thompson expected. Instead, McAllister's face hardened, as if retreating into his role as the authority figure once again. "You're not going anywhere just yet," McAllister finally said, his voice thick with an authority that felt more personal than professional. He seemed determined to maintain control over the interaction, even if that meant pushing the boundaries of propriety. Thompson could feel the officer's discomfort, could see the growing sense of panic in his stance as he tried to justify his actions. A deep sense of injustice stirred in Judge Thompson's chest. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was a moment where someone in a position of power was trying to force him into submission, to remind him of his place, simply because of the color of his skin. Thompson's heart didn't race out of fear, but out of a deep, resolute anger. He had faced this kind of treatment his whole life, but this time, it was different. This time, he wasn't just going to let it slide. "I'm not your suspect, officer," Judge Thompson said, his voice firm and unwavering, "and I won't be treated as one." The words felt powerful in the stillness of the night, a declaration that he would not tolerate such behavior, no matter the circumstances. As the officer stood there, struggling to maintain control, Judge Thompson reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He turned it on, holding it in his hand where McAllister could see it clearly. "I'm recording this, officer," the judge stated simply. "I believe this situation deserves to be documented." McAllister's eyes flicked to the phone, then back to the judge. For a split second, it seemed as if the officer was considering his next move, but instead, he simply let out a short breath, a frustrated exhale. The silence stretched for a moment longer as McAllister's eyes flicked from the phone back to Judge Thompson's face. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. The officer's hand hovered near his belt, where his taser and baton were positioned. He seemed to be reconsidering his approach, realizing that the judge's actions had shifted the power dynamic in the moment. McAllister's discomfort was evident. He wasn't used to being questioned or confronted like this, especially not by someone in the position of authority that Judge Thompson held. For a moment, Thompson stood there, allowing the officer a few seconds to gather himself. He had no intention of escalating the situation any further, but he needed the officer to understand the gravity of his actions. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop. This was about respect, dignity, and equality. Thompson wasn't going to back down. He wasn't just a man in a car being questioned for no reason. He was a judge, a man who had spent years fighting for justice and fairness, and that had to mean something. "Officer, I understand the importance of your job," Thompson said, keeping his voice measured but firm. "But this is not how you are supposed to treat people. You don't pull someone over and demand they get out of their car simply based on assumptions. You didn't have a reason, and you know it." His words weren't meant to provoke, but rather to calmly assert his rights. "I'm not the one who should be nervous here. You're the one who is overstepping your boundaries." McAllister opened his mouth to retort, but then paused, his eyes narrowing. "I don't think you understand the situation here," he finally said, his voice low but still tinged with authority. You've been acting suspicious from the start." "Suspicious?" Thompson's brow furrowed. "I'm acting suspicious." He wasn't sure if he should be frustrated or surprised. The irony of the statement hit him sharply. It wasn't his behavior that was out of place, it was the officer's. The accusation felt hollow, weak, and it stung with the raw reality of racial profiling. "Listen, officer," Thompson continued, his tone taking on a calm but stern edge. "I've been stopped before. I've been questioned before. I've been judged by my appearance and treated unfairly because of my race. But this is different. I'm asking you to treat me with the respect that is due to any citizen, no matter their background or skin color." McAllister took a step back, his eyes narrowing, as if trying to process the judge's words. The moment was heavy, the air thick with the weight of the accusation. The officer had no retort, no defense that could justify what he had done. For a fleeting second, his posture softened, and it seemed like the officer might back down. But instead, his shoulders stiffened again, as if the mask of authority had returned. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're not above the law," McAllister snapped, his voice rising with frustration. Judge Thompson didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened his back, refusing to be intimidated. "No one is above the law, officer, least of all those who enforce it." He held McAllister's gaze firmly. "I'm Judge Marlon Thompson, and I spent my life making sure justice is served fairly. But when people in power like you try to use that power against others for no reason, that's when the system fails." The officer's expression shifted ever so slightly, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it wasn't enough to erase the stubbornness that lingered. For a moment, neither spoke. The reality of the situation settled heavily around them. The judge felt his phone buzzing in his hand, but he didn't check it. He knew the moment he was in would be talked about, shared, and analyzed by the media, by his colleagues, by his community. It was the kind of moment that would inevitably draw attention. But he wasn't concerned about that right now. What mattered was that the officer knew he wouldn't be intimidated. McAllister, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and frustration, finally took a step back. He seemed unsure of how to proceed, almost defeated. But before he could speak again, the sound of another vehicle approaching interrupted the tense standoff. A second police car rolled up to the scene, and as it parked behind the first, the officer inside quickly got out. This new officer, a woman in uniform, moved with confidence. Judge Thompson noticed immediately that she wasn't like McAllister. Her posture was composed, her movements deliberate. She was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority in her presence. As soon as she saw Judge Thompson standing there, she paused for a fraction of a second, recognizing him instantly. There was no mistaking the respect in her eyes. "Everything all right here, Officer McAllister?" she asked, her voice steady but commanding. McAllister turned towards her, but his gaze quickly dropped to the ground, his frustration still simmering. The judge's heart lifted slightly at the sight of the new officer. He knew her, Officer Simone Harris. She had worked in the same precinct for years, and though their paths rarely crossed, they had always exchanged nods of mutual respect when they did. It wasn't just that she was black. Judge Thompson knew Officer Harris to be one of the most professional officers in the force. She was calm, observant, and fair, and she wasn't someone who would tolerate misconduct. "Everything's fine, Simone," McAllister muttered, his voice tinged with something that sounded like defeat. It was clear that his earlier bravado had crumbled in her presence. Judge Thompson smiled briefly, his mind finally easing a little. Officer Harris would handle this. He could trust her to do what was right. And McAllister? He'd have to face the consequences of his actions, whether he liked it or not. The air between the officers was thick with unspoken tension as Officer Harris took in the scene. She glanced at Judge Thompson, his calm demeanor unmistakable, then back at Officer McAllister, whose posture had grown more rigid under her scrutiny. Thompson could sense the shift in the atmosphere. Officer Harris wasn't just there to observe. She was there to take control, to bring this escalating situation back to the realm of professionalism. For a brief moment, McAllister seemed to shrink under Harris's gaze. It was as if the authority he had tried to wield over Thompson was being slowly peeled away, revealing the uncomfortable reality of his actions. He was still a police officer, but in the presence of someone like Officer Harris, his own authority seemed diminished. His eyes darted between her and the judge, clearly unsure how to respond. "Officer McAllister," Officer Harris said, her voice measured and calm, but with a firm undertone. "Could you step aside for a moment?" McAllister's jaw tightened, but he didn't resist. Instead, he took a step back, walking a few paces away from Judge Thompson, his hands stiff at his sides. Thompson, still standing with his phone in hand, didn't take his eyes off of him. The officer had acted out of line, and now it seemed like the truth was beginning to surface. Officer Harris wasn't going to let this moment pass unnoticed. With McAllister momentarily out of the picture, Officer Harris turned her full attention to Thompson. "Judge Thompson," she began, her tone warm but professional, "I want to apologize for the inconvenience and the distress this situation has caused you. I'm sure you've been through enough today already." Her eyes softened, and Thompson saw the sincerity in them. He nodded, appreciating her acknowledgement. "It's not about inconvenience, Officer Harris," Thompson replied, his voice steady. "It's about respect. This officer had no reason to treat me the way he did. I'm a citizen, just like anyone else. I understand the importance of law enforcement, but I also understand that those who enforce the law must follow it too." Officer Harris took a deep breath and gave a slight nod, as if understanding the depth of the judge's words. "I'm aware, sir," she said, "and I assure you this will be addressed." She glanced over her shoulder at McAllister, who was still standing a few feet away, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. "I'll make sure this situation is handled appropriately," Officer Harris continued, her eyes returning to Thompson. "You're absolutely right. Everyone deserves to be treated with fairness and dignity. There's no excuse for what happened here." Thompson's chest tightened, but he could feel the anger he had been carrying dissipate slowly. There was something reassuring in Officer Harris' words, a promise of accountability. He wasn't just an individual trying to make a point. He was being listened to by someone who understood the importance of the system working the way it should. "I'm glad to hear that," Thompson said, his voice now calm but resolute. "Because this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who is pulled over, who is stopped, who is treated unfairly simply because of assumptions. I've spent my entire career fighting for justice in the courts, but justice begins on the streets." Officer Harris nodded, her expression firm. "Absolutely, and I will make sure this is taken seriously. There will be a full report filed, and I will be personally overseeing the review of the incident." Judge Thompson gave a slight nod of approval. He didn't need to be reassured, but it was comforting to know that Officer Harris was on the side of justice. She wasn't going to let this be swept under the rug. A few minutes passed in silence. McAllister stood in the background, his face a mixture of frustration and regret. The situation had gone from bad to worse for him, and now it seemed as though he was simply waiting for whatever consequences would follow. He glanced briefly at Thompson, but the judge didn't return his gaze. After another tense moment, Officer Harris turned to McAllister, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "I think you and I need to have a discussion about procedure," she said. Her words were soft, but the authority behind them made it clear that the officer was in trouble. "I'm going to handle this from here on out." McAllister muttered something under his breath but didn't argue further. It was clear he knew the moment had passed him by. This wasn't just a matter of enforcing the law, it was about upholding integrity, and his actions had clearly crossed the line. Judge Thompson took a deep breath, his mind still heavy with the weight of what had happened. He had stood his ground, but now it was time to let the system work as it should. "Thank you, Officer Harris," he said, his voice steady. "I trust this will be handled properly." "I assure you, Judge Thompson, it will," she replied, her eyes unwavering. "And once again, I'm sorry for the trouble." As she walked back toward McAllister to speak further, Judge Thompson took a final look at the scene around him. The street was quiet again, the flashing lights of the police car no longer blinding him. He had made it clear that he wouldn't be pushed around, no matter who stood in front of him. Now it was time for the rest to fall into place. As Officer Harris spoke quietly with Officer McAllister, Judge Thompson stood off to the side, taking in the scene with a quiet, measured gaze. The situation, though far from resolved, had shifted. It was no longer about a traffic stop gone awry. It had become a moment of reckoning. For McAllister, it was a reminder of the power he held and how easily that power could be misused. For Officer Harris, it was an opportunity to set things right, to ensure that accountability was more than just a word, it was a practice. Thompson's mind replayed the events of the past few minutes, the uncomfortable tension, the weight of McAllister's assumptions, and the quiet strength he had drawn from standing firm. He'd been tested not just as a judge, but as a man who had spent his life confronting injustice. His heart still burned with the memory of how quickly McAllister had escalated the situation, how quickly he had assumed that the judge, just by virtue of being black, was somehow deserving of suspicion. But now there was a sense of relief. Officer Harris had heard him, had acknowledged what had happened, and she was going to make sure that this wasn't ignored. Officer McAllister, meanwhile, was standing off to the side, looking uncomfortable and small. He had been forced to confront the reality of his actions, to face the consequences of the way he had treated Judge Thompson. And though he remained silent, Thompson could tell from the shift in his demeanor that he was beginning to understand just how wrong he had been. There was no longer any pride in the way he stood, no defensive posture, only resignation. He was realizing that the badge he wore didn't give him license to disrespect anyone, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. As Officer Harris finished speaking to McAllister, she turned toward Judge Thompson once more. This time, her approach was calm but purposeful. She made no attempt to apologize again. There was no need. The actions that mattered were the ones that would follow, and Thompson knew she would be true to her word. Judge Thompson, Officer Harris began, her voice even. I've spoken with Officer McAllister. I've explained the seriousness of the situation and the consequences of his actions. We will be filing a formal report, and an internal review will be conducted. Thompson nodded, his mind still swirling with the weight of it all. I appreciate that, Officer Harris. It's important that the system holds those who enforce the law accountable. It's what gives the law its integrity. There's no place for actions like his in law enforcement, especially when they violate the trust we're supposed to uphold, Officer Harris continued, her tone unwavering. He has a lot to reflect on, but this will be handled appropriately. Judge Thompson took a deep breath, a sense of calm starting to settle within him. The adrenaline that had coursed through his veins earlier was fading, replaced by the quiet satisfaction that came with knowing he had made a difference, however small, in that moment. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about setting an example, ensuring that future interactions were different. He was a judge, but more importantly, he was a citizen who believed in the principle of equality under the law. I trust you'll handle it with the seriousness it deserves, Thompson said quietly. He wasn't looking for any more reassurance. He simply wanted to know that what had happened would not go unnoticed, that McAllister's actions would not be brushed aside. Officer Harris gave him a slight, respectful nod. I will, and I'm grateful you stood your ground, Judge Thompson. We need people like you to keep pushing us to do better. This isn't the kind of interaction law enforcement should have with the public. Thompson nodded in acknowledgement. It's easy to forget sometimes. The power of the badge should be used to protect, not to intimidate. A brief silence hung between them before Officer Harris spoke again. We can always do better. That's something I believe in, and I think you do too. Judge Thompson smiled slightly. I do. I've spent my life striving for that. As Officer Harris walked back toward McAllister, it was clear that the situation was far from over, but it was a turning point. There had been a confrontation, but there had also been a resolution, however tentative. McAllister would likely face consequences for his actions. What those would be, only time would tell. But for Judge Thompson, this moment had been a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance, the moments when you stand up against injustice, no matter how subtle, can create ripples that make the world just a little bit more just. As the officers prepared to leave, McAllister was still standing quietly off to the side. His face remained flushed with shame, but there was a change in the air, a change that Thompson knew would carry through to the next time McAllister donned his uniform and stood in judgment of someone else. He had learned a hard lesson today, and for that, Thompson was both grateful and resolute. The road ahead wasn't always easy, but moments like these proved that change was possible, even in the smallest, most unexpected ways. The flashing lights dimmed as the patrol cars pulled away, leaving the quiet street behind them. Judge Thompson stood for a moment longer, reflecting on what had transpired. Then, with a deep breath, he climbed back into his car, ready to face the rest of his evening. The fight for justice, after all, was never over. The drive home was a quiet one for Judge Thompson. As he cruised down the familiar roads, the city lights flickering in the distance, his mind replayed the events of the evening. The tension of the traffic stop, the face of Officer McAllister, the calm confidence of Officer Harris. It all played out like a series of images in his mind. But beyond the details of the incident, he couldn't help but think of something deeper: the consequences of what had happened. This wasn't just a single confrontation. It was a moment that had the potential to spark something larger. What McAllister had done was part of a broader systemic issue, something Judge Thompson had seen throughout his career. Racial profiling, unjust treatment of black people by law enforcement, these were not isolated occurrences. They were part of a pattern that continued to haunt communities across the nation. And yet, despite everything, Thompson remained hopeful. The ripple effect of his actions tonight could be far-reaching, but it depended on how things unfolded from here. He had stood his ground not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever faced unfair treatment. His hope was that this situation, once reviewed and addressed, would become a turning point, an opportunity for change within the department, for McAllister to reflect on his behavior, and for people like Officer Harris to continue their work with integrity. As he pulled into his driveway, Thompson sat in his car for a moment longer. He thought of his children, his two teenagers who had grown up in a world that was sometimes harsh, sometimes unfair. They were aware of the struggles faced by people of color in this country, and he had spent countless hours teaching them about justice, equality, and the importance of standing up for what was right. But he also knew how difficult it was to navigate a system that often seemed stacked against them. Thompson let out a deep breath as he finally opened the door and stepped out of the car. His wife, Deborah, was waiting for him inside, as always. She had been his partner through everything: the challenges, the triumphs, and the difficult moments that came with his position. She could always tell when something had weighed on his mind, even if he didn't say a word. "How was your day?" Deborah asked, her voice warm, though her eyes searched his face for any sign of distress. Thompson hesitated for a moment before answering. "It was complicated, but I think something important happened today." He gave her a tired but determined smile. She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What happened?" Thompson sighed, sitting down beside her on the couch. "I was pulled over. A young officer stopped me, accused me of something that wasn't true. He acted as though I didn't belong, just because of how I looked. At first, I was angry, but then I realized I had to stand my ground." Deborah listened intently, her expression softening as he spoke. "And what happened?" "The officer who stopped me, Officer McAllister, he was convinced something was wrong with me. It wasn't until Officer Harris showed up that things started to change. She recognized me, treated me with respect, and ensured that the situation didn't escalate further. She promised me that McAllister's actions would be reviewed." Deborah nodded, her hand resting gently on his. "I'm proud of you, Marlon. It's never easy to confront that kind of injustice head-on, especially when it's someone in a position of power. But you didn't back down." Thompson smiled faintly, the weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders. "It wasn't just for me, Deb. It was for everyone who's ever had to face that kind of treatment. For everyone who's had their dignity stripped away by someone who should have been protecting them. I hope Officer McAllister learns from this. But I also hope that it sets an example. This isn't just about one bad officer. It's about making sure the system works as it should." Deborah squeezed his hand, her voice filled with pride. "I know you'll make sure of that. You've been doing it your whole life." The conversation drifted into a comfortable silence as the couple settled into their evening. But Thompson knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be challenging, and the impact of his actions would unfold slowly. The internal review of Officer McAllister would take time, and there would be people who would question his decision to challenge an officer in the first place. But he also knew that justice wasn't always easy. It was messy, complicated, and sometimes even uncomfortable, but it was worth fighting for. As Thompson lay in bed that night, his thoughts continued to swirl. He knew the attention the incident would get. The media would likely pick up the story, the debate about policing, and racial profiling would grow louder, and the ripples from this moment would spread far beyond what he could predict. But that was okay. The truth had been spoken, and the system, however flawed, had started to turn in the right direction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now he allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing he had done what he could to make a difference. The following week brought a cascade of attention to the incident. Judge Thompson had expected a measure of media coverage, but even he was surprised at how far the story spread. News outlets, social media platforms, and even community leaders began discussing the encounter, sparking conversations about racial profiling, police conduct, and the need for reform in law enforcement. For Thompson, the aftermath was a mixture of pride and trepidation. While he knew he had done the right thing by standing up for himself, he also understood the weight of the larger implications. The spotlight had now shifted to the police department, and people were watching to see what steps they would take next. Would they take the situation seriously, or would it be swept under the rug? But for all the external attention, Thompson remained focused on the most important thing: the potential for change. Officer McAllister was now under review, but Thompson wasn't expecting any immediate drastic changes. He knew these things took time, and the system often moved slower than it should. But what mattered most to him was that the discussion had been ignited. Whether McAllister's actions were corrected in the short term or not, the reality was that the department, and perhaps even the wider community, could no longer ignore the issue. A few days after the incident, Officer Harris reached out to Thompson to provide an update. She told him that the internal review was underway, and that McAllister had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. She also informed him that there had been a shift within the department's leadership to examine broader patterns of misconduct and racial bias. Thompson was cautiously optimistic, but knew that real reform would require more than just one incident. "It's a start," Officer Harris had said during their phone call, "but it's up to all of us to keep pushing for change." Thompson couldn't have agreed more. He was a judge, but he was also a citizen, a father, and a member of a community that had long been subjected to unequal treatment. This wasn't just about holding one officer accountable, it was about holding the entire system accountable. He understood that his fight for justice wasn't over, and this incident, though painful, was another step in a long journey. In the days that followed, Thompson's family became more involved in the conversation. His children, who had watched the news coverage, had questions about the nature of police authority, and his son, in particular, wanted to know how they could help ensure such things didn't happen again. "It's about standing up, Dad," his son had said, his voice earnest. "You showed everyone that we don't just have to accept unfairness. We can do something about it." Thompson smiled, proud of the young man his son was becoming. It wasn't just the kids he was concerned about, it was the community at large. In the wake of the incident, several local organizations reached out to him, expressing their support and asking if he would participate in discussions about police reform. Thompson agreed, feeling a sense of responsibility to use his platform for change. One evening, as he sat down to a community forum, Thompson shared his experience with a group of concerned citizens. The crowd was filled with a mixture of emotions: anger, hope, frustration, but most of all, there was a palpable sense of urgency. People were ready to talk, to demand accountability, and to take steps toward healing. Thompson spoke candidly about the power of standing firm in the face of injustice and how every individual had a role to play in ensuring equality. "We need to continue holding our public servants to the highest standards," he said. We cannot allow anyone, regardless of their position, to act outside the law. But we also need to ensure that we work together to create a system that is fair to all. As the forum came to a close, Thompson felt a renewed sense of purpose. His role had shifted from merely responding to an injustice to actively participating in a movement for change. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about creating a world where fairness and dignity were not optional, but guaranteed for everyone. In the weeks that followed, Officer McAllister's disciplinary process played out in the public eye. He faced a range of consequences, including sensitivity training, a suspension, and a mandatory review of his conduct. The department also began implementing reforms aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within their ranks. While it wasn't a perfect system, Thompson saw the first steps toward a shift that could one day lead to meaningful change. By the time the media attention had waned and the spotlight shifted elsewhere, Judge Thompson felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had stood up when it mattered, not just for himself, but for everyone who had faced the harsh reality of racial bias. His actions had started a conversation, and that conversation was the beginning of something greater. The fight for justice would continue, of course. There would be setbacks, there would be frustration, and there would be days when progress seemed slow. But Thompson knew one thing for certain. The struggle for fairness and dignity was far from over, and he would continue to fight, because even the smallest ripple, when it gathers enough momentum, could change the course of an entire tide.